Hey, Scott Horton here to tell you about this great new book by Michael Swanson, The War State. In The War State, Swanson examines how Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy both expanded and fought to limit the rise of the new national security state after World War II. If this nation is ever to live up to its creed of liberty and prosperity for everyone, we are going to have to abolish the empire. Know your enemy. Get The War State by Michael Swanson. It's available at your local bookstore or at Amazon.com in Kindle or in paperback. Just click the book in the right margin at scotthorton.org or thewarstate.com. All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. I'm Scott Horton. I got Eric Margolis on the line. He writes at ericmargolis.com, spelled like Margolis. ericmargolis.com, and also at uns.com and at lourockwell.com. Welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm fine, Scott. I'm gearing up to watch this latest Afghan election carnival coming up.
Well, you know, I was reading about that in the Google News earlier, and I thought poor Eric Margolis got egg all over his face as the American mission, the surge and counterinsurgency mission to create a modern Westphalian democratic nation state there in Afghanistan takes firm hold. And everything you've ever said about Afghanistan over the last decade is proven wrong. So I figured I'd bring you on to make fun of you, you know?
Well, thank you, Scott. There are a lot of people who would like to. You know, one thing that my fellow people in the media will never forgive is when you're right and they're wrong. So a lot of people unhappy with me.
Yeah, well, all right. So now who's running? They got I read something was Robert Dreyfuss had a good rundown of the different guys running together, the different running mate groups, and it's one warlord that I've heard of for each pair, and there's 5 or 6 pairs, I guess.
It's, this is what's known in Washington as democracy, but I can tell you when I was in Afghanistan during the 1980s and the Soviets were occupying it, they actually ran more democratic elections than we Americans have been running, I'm not proud to say.
Really?
Yeah.
And that's not speaking highly of their process at all, I don't think.
No, it isn't. No, it isn't. But at least the Soviets allowed some real opposition parties, whereas the election that will occur on Saturday is just Afghan kabuki directed by the Americans, in that all the candidates have been approved by Washington. Some of them are out of CIA central casting. And the rest are a bunch of drug-dealing warlords, which we should really have nothing to do with. We should be ashamed to have dealing with them. And the outcome has been predetermined. I don't know who it's going to be yet, but I can tell you that it's whoever Washington wants it to be.
Yeah. Well, you know, I don't know, because I seem to remember that the last time they did this back in the fall of 2009, they tried to steal the election from Karzai and give it to Abdullah, and they even outed Karzai's brother as a CIA agent and a dope dealer. Not that those two things would ever go together or anything, on the front pages of the New York Times to try to make Karzai look bad, but then Karzai stole the election out from under him anyway, right?
That's correct. They flubbed the effort to rig the election. But the Americans
stole it better than they stole it.
That's exactly right. Karzai is an interesting person. You know, he was a CIA asset. That is, as I said, in CIA central casting, being held in reserve whenever they needed a leader for Afghanistan. You can always tell who the U.S. vetted people are because they speak flawless English and wear shirts and ties and don't have long beards.
I remember.
But Karzai, the problem is he's been a disobedient puppet as time's gone by, and he's seen what's happening with the war. He's tried to create a separate identity for himself as an Afghan nationalist rather than as somebody subservient to Washington. And he said, in fact, a while back, he said the only thing that NATO has achieved in Afghanistan is to kill civilians.
Yeah.
And he's doing it now, so he's positioning himself that behind the scenes he'll still wield a lot of influence.
Oh, so you don't think he's just going to hop on the first Learjet out of town and go live on a hillside in Switzerland somewhere?
He might do that. He might do that, too. There are a lot of people who are gunning for him. I wouldn't like to be his life insurer.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when it comes to Afghan democracy, the person of Hamid Karzai, I like to sometimes just pretend about what it's going to be like, say, I don't know, 50 or 100 years in the future, looking back on the history of this, where, all in the name of democracy from the very beginning. They installed this guy in power, and I remember back from the very get-go on NPR, they were talking about, well, he's just here as the placeholder until the first elections are held. And here he's been in there the whole time. And in '04, the BBC was reporting how his men were going around and threatening these villagers, vote Karzai or we'll burn your house down. This is, talk about Soviet-style elections. You got one name on the ballot, this guy. And then it was even the American sock puppeteers in charge of him who were complaining about all he does is sit around shooting junk all day. And that's their complaint about him is that he doesn't have enough authority to rule the country. He's not even the mayor of Kabul. He's the mayor of his own damn palace.
Well, that's so because he has been surrounded by American bodyguards for a long time. They wouldn't even trust their own Afghans. There were many plots to kill him. But the whole thing is a sordid snake pit with Karzai and the other so-called Western-backed Afghan politicians. None of them have any credibility except for the warlords from the Uzbek and Tajik north. And at least Karzai is a Pashtun, which is the majority ethnic group in Afghanistan. But the crazy thing with this election, the reason I say it's fraud, I don't even need to know the details. It's a fraud because Taliban and its smaller ally Hizb Islami have been banned from the election. And they're, in fact, boycotting it as well. That's like running an election in the U.S. and banning Democrats and saying it's a fair and square election. Yeah. So if they could hold a fair election today, I would be willing to bet that Taliban would probably win.
Or at least
they won't.
Substantially, they would win. They would benefit tremendously, at some level. Anyway, and you know what? Here's how I don't understand. I mean, even if they're not leaving, and I know they don't want to leave, they want whoever wins to sign a new immunity deal and keep at least, 20 or 40,000 troops till 2024 or whenever, as long as they can, that kind of thing. But it seems like, hey, if you're going to keep 20 or 40,000 troops there, you're going to have to make a deal. And that was actually the plan all along, right? Of the surge was we're going to beat on them real bad for a year and a half, and then we're going to bring them to the table. I know they never really did that. That was supposed to happen in the middle of 11, after all. Here we are still, 3 years after that almost. But it seems like, at some level they recognize, right? Holbrooke recognized, all these guys recognize that in order to even stay, never mind declare victory and leave, in order to even stay, they're going to have to compromise with these guys. Now, maybe they don't want to let them win elections, but they're going to have to make some kind of serious concessions to the Taliban at some point, right? Because they're not going to leave themselves with the ability to really wage war against them anymore, it doesn't sound like.
That's exactly right, Scott. The Taliban represent the Pashtuns of southern Afghanistan. They're the majority in the country. And the problem is that the U.S. demonized Taliban from day one. And they're wife beaters and baby burners and God knows what. And they demonized them so much that they excluded the ability to negotiate with them. And now no American politician has the guts to come out and say, we ought to make a deal with Taliban. But you're quite right. They're going to have to, and the Taliban knows it. And I can tell you what's going on right now in Afghanistan, because I saw that in the last days of Soviet occupation, all the Afghans who were working for the Soviets, collaborating with the Soviets, are frantically making side deals with then the Mujahideen, and today it will be with Taliban, trying to protect themselves because they fear that when the U.S. withdraws, and particularly when the spigot of the American money is cut off, that the whole rotten apparatus in Kabul will collapse.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, they must be all cutting side deals all along. And speaking of that, by the way, you've mentioned on the show many times how Massoud, who always has, he's the legend in Rambo 3 and all this, what people remember as the leader of the Mujahideen, that he had made a side deal with the Soviets going back, I don't know how far.
Absolutely.
And I read a thing just the other day where, was it his son or his brother or somebody like this is now one of these candidates?
That's correct. He's tied up with the Tajik candidate Abdullah, easy name to remember.
Yeah,
who's actually half Pashtun too, but he's representing the northern Tajiks, what they call in Afghanistan the Panjshir Valley Mafia, and they are very tied in with Russian intelligence. And this Northern Alliance, which we the United States used to help overthrow the Taliban, are the biggest drug dealers in Afghanistan. And not only were they the biggest then, but now they've grown even bigger because the only progress made in Afghanistan is it's increased its exports of drugs under our control.
And is there an American foreign policy there? That's just a compromise with these guys because they have the ability to maintain some order through their criminal networks and that kind of thing, or what?
They're useful as enemies of the Taliban and the Pashtun, but I think American policy is being driven by the military, by the Pentagon, and the Pentagon wants to keep the Tajiks, and the Uzbeks. Led by the major war criminal General Rashid Dostum, who has been much in evidence. He's also involved in the electoral race. Wants to keep them as valuable allies, because during the Soviet occupation, the Uzbeks and the Tajiks, minorities who hate the Pashtuns, collaborated with the Soviet invaders. Then they collaborated with the American invaders, and today the U.S. is counting on them to sustain the American presence.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm sorry we don't have too much time before we go out to break here, but the Americans in all this time, I mean, other than the fact that Karzai is a Pashtun, have they really done anything to try to help to cultivate some sort of political representation for the Pashtun tribesmen other than the Taliban? Or have they really done anything to try to twist the arms of the Tajiks and the Uzbeks and the Hazars that they've been backing in Kabul, in power there, to try to make them really compromise? Because it seems like Karzai's the one Pashtun with power in the city, and he's just it's just ornamental or whatever that he's actually a Pashtun, no?
Well, he has, Karzai has some support, not very broad and certainly not deep, but the Americans have frustrated attempts by Karzai to bring the Taliban into the political process.
Yeah. We'll be right back in just a sec after this, y'all. Hey, I'm Scott Horton here for The Future of Freedom, the monthly journal of the Future Freedom Foundation at fff.org/subscribe. Since 1989, FFF has been pushing an uncompromising moral and economic case for peace, individual liberty, and free markets. Sign up now for The Future Freedom, featuring founder and president Jacob Hornberger, as well as Sheldon Richmond, James Bovard, Anthony Gregory, Wendy McElroy, and many more. It's just $25 a year for the print edition, $15 per year to read it online. That's fff.org/subscribe. And tell them Scott sent you. All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Eric Margolis about these bogus elections in Afghanistan, this wonderful democracy the Republicans and Democrats have built over there. And I'm sure you probably saw, Eric, about this Associated Press photographer who was murdered this morning while covering the fake election. Come on, we're going to pass out the ballots to the tribesmen. It'll be a great photo op for the AP. And this lady lost her life reporting on it. And when the whole thing, it might as well be taking place on a stage somewhere, for as real as it all is. Oh, I'm sorry, and we can get back to that in just a second, but I wanted to follow up a little bit on that, where we left it hanging was, is there anything the Americans could have done, I mean, assuming the decade-long occupation here, to try to cultivate any kind of political representation for the Pashtuns other than the Taliban? It seems like as long as you and I have been talking, which is this whole time pretty much, they don't have anybody with any force, with any, actual ability to fight for, literally fight for them other than the Taliban. So it's not that anybody really loves these guys. They're pretty bad guys, but they're not as bad as like Al-Qaeda types, really. And they don't have anywhere else to turn, basically. Seems to be the order of the day all these many, many days now.
We, the United States, could have tried to establish some links with the Pashtun people. By the way, a large chunk of the Pashtun people are also on the other side of the border in Pakistan, so they're very, very politically important. But efforts to talk to Taliban, which were started in Qatar and then in Dubai, were failed. They were shut down, thwarted by the U.S. Efforts by Pakistan to talk to its Taliban insurgents in the tribal territories were also thwarted by the Americans, who killed the Pakistani Taliban leader at the time. So the U.S. has not wanted talks, except talks of more or less, we'll do whatever you say, Buana, that kind of thing. But they want no recognition of Taliban. They prefer to deal with the Quislings and drug dealers from the Tajiks and the Uzbeks.
Right. And yeah, all I was getting at earlier about the drugs too was, in the 80s, the CIA needed the money, right, for the secret wars in Central America because of the Boland Amendment and all that. So they had to do the covert drug dealing in order to pay for the covert machete wielding. But in this case, they've got a blank check to do whatever the hell they want. So, although I guess I can see why their sock puppets still, would like a permission slip to make as much money as they can selling heroin. So that makes sense,
Well, drug money fuels all these warlords, plus U.S. cash that's handed over in big bags of $100 bills. But the drug trade, drug money, is the only source of commerce and income in Afghanistan. So it's very important.
Yeah. Well, I think we remember from 2008, it even broke into USA Today and the New York Times, and everybody else had to admit, I think, at some point there that, boy, all the cash from the global drug black market sure saved a lot of our banks from failure. When we needed a quick injection of funds, we went to our drug cartels and said, please give us some cash. Tens of billions of dollars a year, maybe more than that, right?
Doing what J.P. Morgan used to do.
Yeah, exactly. The Fed's job.
But what I find particularly distressing, I go way back into the 1980s in Afghanistan and covered two of the wars there, and I was at the birth of Taliban, too. But the American media has learned nothing and continues to give support worthy of the old Soviet media to these current elections. And I haven't seen anybody really questioning the whole process of fake elections any more than the American media questioned fake elections across the Arab world, like in Egypt and Tunisia, and what about Saudi Arabia?
Right. Well, I think maybe part of that is that they're hopeful that the war's going to be over by the end of the year anyway, so who cares if it's on the way out anyway, kind of thing. Of course, the real worry is that, no, they're running an election of fake sock puppets against each other so that whoever wins will sign on the piece of paper that says you can stay. You're invited to stay, please.
Well, I know it's so transparent. It's pathetic. The Roman Empire used to keep a stable of kings and monarchs in Rome for whenever they needed to send somebody out to set up a new Roman sphere of influence. They'd send one of these guys out. We're doing the same, but the idea of these guys who have a gun to their heads and whose total income comes from the U.S., that they're going to represent the interests of Afghanistan, not likely.
I read this thing by Carlotta Gall, the New York Times reporter there in Afghanistan all these years. And, she's done some good work and whatever. I don't want to completely, trash her or whatever. But, it was this long thing. And, of course, it had the accusations about the ISI keeping Osama for whoever, I don't know, themselves, the Saudis, whatever. But then at the end, she really started. It was a pretty long article. Maybe it was the Weekend Magazine or some New York Times Magazine or something. And at the end, it talks about how, the project of creating this Westphalian democratic nation state, multi-ethnic nation state in Afghanistan, the project is only half done. And
really would be a tragedy to call it off now. And I mean, that's as far as their imagination can work, is that if it hasn't worked yet, it's simply just because it's too early to stop. That's the only thing that they can think of. You know?
That's pathetic. Those kind of attitudes are worthy of babes in toyland. I'm surprised that a journalist who's been there all these years would say something like that. As someone who knows, the Afghan tribes, I think there's never going to be democracy there. They don't want it. They're not going to do it. All the Pashtun tribes, 60 to 70% of the population, wanted to be left alone and to go and do things the way they've always done, feud and fight and, grow pot and just generally be miserable, be their happy, miserable selves. And they're hillbillies. And they don't want anybody from the outside world. They don't need this phony democracy that we promote because they have their own tribal system, which is much more effective, of Loya Jirga, as it's called, tribal councils. They have their own. They've been democratic in this sense forever. We're trying to impose a fake Western construct on them. It's not going to work. Hasn't worked. And we should really give up. But we're paying just lip service to this. Our real intent is not to promote democracy or women's rights, as it's been falsely claimed, but to keep our military bases there and keep the Chinese out.
Yeah. Well, do the Chinese even want to come in with anything more than loafers and briefcases anyway? I don't get it.
No, well, the Chinese are starting to exploit some of Afghanistan's mineral wealth, which is said to be substantial. But the Americans want to keep the military there to overwatch the Caspian oil basins, to keep in play in Central Asia. It's a complicated situation. Unfortunately, we've run out of money to support such grandiose imperial ambitions.
Yeah, fortunately. Well, from their point of view, how come they're picking this fight? They're so concerned with picking this fight with Russia when if they want to pivot to Asia and they want to stay in Afghanistan and do all these things simply to contain China, don't they need Russia's help for that? That's what Dana Rohrabacher said. He was like, don't pick a fight with Putin. I was like, hey, that's pretty good. And he says, we need Putin for going to war with the Chinese with.
He's right. Good old Dana. He's right in this sense. But what's happening in Washington is total irrationality in the American ruling circles and in the court media. There's bloodlust. We want our wars. We love this kind of thing. And people are thrilled in Washington because suddenly you've got a big enemy coming up again who can justify aircraft carriers and, billions of worth of jet fighters and all kinds of stuff that we couldn't justify with the Afghans. So there's a thrill about it, and it's visceral, and it's childish nationalism that's reasserting itself.
Yeah. It's funny because it seems sort of obvious, but then again, I think most people just really don't get that. But, I'm reminded the way you put that, I'm reminded of the polls where residents of Washington, D.C. think the economy's doing great and everybody else's economic optimism is at the lowest levels in forever, right? But they really do live in an entirely different world than us, like kids. Right, like you could be Donald Rumsfeld and walk down the street and nobody thinks you're crazy because they're all crazy too.
Well, thank you, George Bush, for that, creating the imperial government in Washington and doubling the size of government and having all these crazies running around the Beltway as national security contractors and stuff like that. Very frightening, but unfortunately, now we are being unsophisticated. A senior Russian said the other day, we should be taking tranquilizers, not getting so whipped up. And I have some Republican friends of mine who say, whoa, we've got to do something about Crimea. I said, turn around and ask your best friends to name 3 major cities in Crimea.
Yeah, or even one. Come on. All right, we're done here. We got to go. Thanks so much, Eric. Appreciate it.
Cheers, Scott.
Everybody, that's Eric Margolis. He wrote American Raj, liberation or domination, and war at the top of the world. And he writes at ericmargolis.com, uns.com, and lourockwell.com. So go and read him and get smart. Hey, y'all, Scott here. Ever wanted to help support the show and own silver at the same time? Well, a friend of mine, libertarian activist Arlo Pignati, has invented the alternative currency with the most promise of them all. QR silver commodity discs. The first ever QR code 1-ounce silver pieces. Just scan the back of one with your phone and get the instant spot price. They're perfect for saving or spending at the market. And anyone who donates $100 or more to the Scott Horton Show at scotthorton.org/donate gets one. That's scotthorton.org/donate. And if you'd like to learn and order more, send them a message at commoditydiscs.com or check them out on Facebook at /commoditydiscs. And thanks.
Don't worry about things you can't control. Isn't that what they always say? But it's about impossible to avoid worrying about what's going on these days. The government has used the war on guns, the war on drugs, and the war on terrorism to tear our Bill of Rights to shreds. But you can fight back. The 10th Amendment Center has proven it, racking up major victories. For example, when the U.S. government claimed authority in the NDAA to have the military kidnap and detain Americans without trial, the nullifiers got a law passed in California, declaring the state's refusal to ever participate in any such thing. Their latest project is offnow.org, nullifying the National Security Agency. They've already gotten model legislation introduced in California, Arizona, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Kansas, meant to limit the power of the NSA to spy on Americans in those states. We'd be fools to wait around for the U.S. Congress or courts to roll back Big Brother. Our best chance is nullification and interposition on the state level. Go to offnow.org, print out that model legislation, and get to work nullifying the NSA. The hero Edward Snowden has risked everything to give us this chance. Let's take it. offnow.org. Hey, y'all, Sky here. First, I want to take a second to thank all the show's listeners, sponsors, and supporters for helping make the show what it is. I literally couldn't do it without you. And now I want to tell you about the newest way to help support the show. Whenever you shop at Amazon.com, stop by scotthorton.org first, and just click the Amazon logo on the right side of the page. That way, the show will get a kickback from Amazon's end of the sale. It won't cost you an extra cent. And it's not just books. Amazon.com sells just about everything in the world, except cars, I think. So whatever you need, they've got it. Just click the Amazon logo on the right side of the page at scotthorton.org, or go to scotthorton.org/Amazon. Hey y'all, Scott Horton here for cashintocoins.com. So you want to buy some Bitcoins? Cashintocoins.com makes it fast, easy, and safe to get Bitcoins. Just deposit the money into their account at any of the major banks they support, and then just email them a picture of the receipt and your Bitcoin address, and you get your Bitcoins. Almost always the same day it clears. In a tough, competitive new market, cashintocoins.com has the advantage. A great system and great customer service to keep you coming back. That's cashintocoins.com. Just click the link in the right margin at scotthorton.org.